This is a Durkin Hayes audio production.
The Affair of the Pink Pearl. "What on earth are you doing?" demanded Tuppence, as she entered the inner sanctum of the International Detective Agency, slogan Blunt's Brilliant Detectives, and discovered her lord and master prone on the floor in a sea of books. Tommy struggled to his feet. "I was trying to arrange these books on the top shelf of the cupboard," he complained, "and the damned chair gave way." "What are they, anyway?" asked Tuppence, picking up a volume. "The Hound of the Baskervilles. I wouldn't mind reading that again sometime." "You see the idea?" said Tommy, dusting himself down with care. "Half hours with the great masters, that sort of thing. You see, Tuppence, I can't help feeling that we are more or less amateurs at this business. Of course, amateurs in one sense we cannot help being, but it would do no harm to acquire the technique, so to speak. These books are detective stories by the leading masters of the art. I intend to try different styles and compare results." Said Tuppence. "I often wonder how these detectives would have got on in real life." She picked up another volume. "You'll find a difficulty in being a Thorndyke. You've no medical experience, and less legal, and I never heard that science was your strong point." "Perhaps not," said Tommy. "But at any rate, I bought a very good camera, and I shall photograph footprints and enlarge the negatives and all that sort of thing. Now, mon ami, use your little grey cells. What does this convey to you?" He pointed to the bottom shelf of the cupboard. On it lay a somewhat futuristic dressing gown, a Turkish slipper, and a violin. "Obvious, my dear Watson," said Tuppence. "Exactly," said Tommy. "The Sherlock Holmes touch." He took up the violin and drew the bow idly across the strings, causing Tuppence to wail in agony. At that moment the buzzer rang on the desk, a sign that a client had arrived in the outer office and was being held in parley by Albert, the office boy. Tommy hastily replaced the violin in the cupboard and kicked the books behind the desk. "Not that there's any great hurry," he remarked. "Albert will be handing them out the stuff about my being engaged with Scotland Yard on the phone. Get into your office and start typing, Tuppence. It makes the office sound busy and active. No. On second thoughts, you shall be taking notes in shorthand from my dictation. Let's have a look before we get Albert to send the victim in." They approached the peephole, which had been artistically contrived so as to command a view of the outer office. The client was a girl of about Tuppence's age, tall and dark, with a rather haggard face and scornful eyes. "Clothes cheap and striking," remarked Tuppence. "Have her in, Tommy." In another minute the girl was shaking hands with the celebrated Mr. Blunt, while Tuppence sat by with eyes demurely downcast and a pad and pencil in hand. "My confidential secretary, Miss Robinson," said Mr. Blunt, with a wave of his hand. "You may speak freely before her." Then he lay back for a minute, half-closed his eyes, and remarked in a tired tone, "You must find travelling in a bus very crowded at this time of day." "I came in a taxi," said the girl. "Oh," said Tommy, aggrieved. His eyes rested reproachfully on a blue bus ticket protruding from her glove. The girl's eyes followed his glance, and she smiled and drew it out. "You mean this? I picked it up on the pavement. A little neighbour of ours collects them." Tuppence coughed, and Tommy threw a baleful glare at her. "We must get down to business," he said briskly. "You are in the need of our services, Miss, "Kingston Bruce is my name," said the girl. "We live at Wimbledon. Last night a lady who was staying with us lost a valuable pink pearl. Mr. St. Vincent was also dining with us, and during dinner he happened to mention your firm. My mother sent me off this morning to ask you if you would look into the matter for us." The girl spoke sullenly, almost disagreeably. It was clear as daylight that she and her mother had not agreed over the matter. She was here under protest. "I see," said Tommy, a little puzzled. You have not called in the police? No, said Miss Kingston Bruce. We haven't. Be idiotic to call in the police and then find the silly thing had rolled under the fireplace or something like that. Oh, said Tommy. Then the jewel may only be lost after all. Miss Kingston Bruce shrugged her shoulders. People make such a fuss about things, she murmured. Tommy cleared his throat. Of course, he said doubtfully. I'm extremely busy just now. Oh, I quite understand, said the girl, rising to her feet. There was a quick gleam of satisfaction in her eyes, which Tuppence, for one, did not miss. Nevertheless, continued Tommy, I think I can manage to run down to Wimbledon. Will you give me the address, please? The Laurels, Edgeworth Road. Make a note of it, please, Miss Robinson. Miss Kingston Bruce hesitated, then said rather ungraciously, We'll expect you then. Morning. Funny girl, said Tommy when she'd left. Couldn't quite make her out. I wonder if she stole the thing herself, remarked Tuppence thoughtfully. Come on, Tommy, let's put away these books and take the car and go down there. By the way, who are you going to be? Sherlock Holmes still? I think I need to practice for that, said Tommy. Came rather a cropper over that bus ticket, didn't I? You did, said Tuppence. If I were you, I shouldn't try too much on that girl. She's as sharp as a needle. She's unhappy, too, poor devil. I suppose you know all that about her already, said Tommy, with sarcasm, simply from looking at the shape of her nose. I'll tell you my idea of what we shall find at the Laurels, said Tuppence, quite unmoved. A household of snobs, very keen to move in the best society. The father, if there is a father, is sure to have a military title. The girl falls in with their way of life and despises herself for doing so. Tommy took a last look at the books now neatly arranged upon the shelf. I think, he said thoughtfully, that I shall be Thorndyke today. I shouldn't have thought there was anything medico-legal about this case, remarked Tuppence. Perhaps not, said Tommy. But I'm simply dying to use that new camera of mine. It's supposed to have the most marvellous lens that ever was or could be. I know those kind of lenses, said Tuppence. By the time you've adjusted the shutter and stopped down and calculated the exposure and kept your eye on the spirit level, your brain gives out, and you yearn for the simple brownie. Only an unambitious soul is content with a simple brownie. Well, I bet I shall get better results with it than you will. Tommy ignored the challenge. I ought to have a smoker's companion, he said regretfully. I wonder where one buys them. There's always the patent corkscrew Aunt Araminta gave you last Christmas, said Tuppence helpfully. That's true, said Tommy. Curious-looking engine of destruction, I thought it at the time. Rather a humorous present to get from a strictly teetotal aunt. I, said Tuppence, shall be Polton. Tommy looked at her scornfully. Polton, indeed? You couldn't begin to do one of the things that he does. Yes, I can, said Tuppence. I can rub my hands together when I'm pleased. That's quite enough to get on with. I hope you're going to take plaster casts of footprints. Tommy was reduced to silence. Having collected the corkscrew, they went round to the garage, got out the car, and started for Wimbledon. The Laurels was a big house. It ran somewhat to gables and turrets, had an air of being very newly painted, and was surrounded with neat flower beds filled with scarlet geraniums. A tall man with a close-cropped white moustache and an exaggeratedly martial bearing opened the door before Tommy had time to ring. "Ah, been looking out for you," he explained fussily. "Mr. Blunt, is it not? I am Colonel Kingston Bruce. Do come into my study." He led them into a small room at the back of the house. "Young St. Vincent was telling me wonderful things about your firm. I've noticed your advertisements myself. This guaranteed 24-hour service of yours, marvellous notion. That's exactly what we need." Inwardly anathematizing Tuppence for her irresponsibility in inventing this brilliant detail, Tommy replied, "Just so, Colonel." "Whole thing most distressing, sir. Most distressing." "Perhaps you would kindly give me the facts," said Tommy, with a hint of impatience. Certainly I will. At once. We have at the present moment staying with us a very old and dear friend of ours, Lady Laura Barton, daughter of the late Earl of Carraway. Present Earl, her brother, made a striking speech at the House of Lords the other day. As I say, she is an old and dear friend of ours. Some American friends of mine have just come over, the Hamilton Betts, most anxious to meet her. Nothing easier, I said. She's staying with me now, come down for the weekend. Oh, you know what Americans are about titles, Mr. Blunt. And others besides Americans, sometimes, Colonel Kingston Bruce. Oh, lass, too true, my dear sir. Nothing I hate more than a snob. Well, I was saying, the Betts came down for the weekend. Last night, we were playing bridge at the time, the clasp of a pendant Mrs. Hamilton Betts was wearing broke. So she took it off and laid it down on a small table, meaning to take it upstairs with her when she went. This, however, she forgot to do. I must explain, Mr. Blunt, that the pendant consisted of 2 small diamond wings and a big pink pearl depending from them. The pendant was found this morning lying where Mrs. Betts had left it, but the pearl, a pearl of enormous value, had been wrenched off. Who found the pendant? The parlour-maid, Gladys Hill. Any reason to suspect her? She's been with us for some years, and we've always found her perfectly honest. But of course one never knows. Exactly. Will you describe your staff, and also tell me who was present at dinner last night? Well, there's the cook. She's been with us only 2 months, but then she'd have no occasion to go near the drawing room. The same applies to the kitchen maid. Then there's the housemaid, Alice Cummings. Oh, she also has been with us for some years, and Lady Laura's maid. Oh, she's French. Colonel Kingston Bruce looked very impressive as he said this. Tommy, unaffected by the revelation of the maid's nationality, said, Exactly. And the party at dinner? Mr. and Mrs. Betts, ourselves, my wife and daughter, and Lady Laura. Young St. Vincent was dining with us, and Mr. Rennie looked in after dinner for a while. Who is Mr. Rennie? A most pestilential fellow. Arrant socialist. Oh, good-looking, of course, with a certain specious power of argument, but a man, I don't mind telling you, whom I wouldn't trust a yard, and dangerous sort of a fellow. In fact, said Tommy dryly, it is Mr. Rennie whom you suspect. I do, Mr. Blunt, yes. Yes, I'm sure, holding the views he does, that he can have no principles whatever. I mean, what could have been easier for him than to have quietly wrenched off the pearl at a moment when we were all absorbed in our game? There were several absorbing moments, a redoubled no-trump hand, I remember, and also a painful argument when my wife had the misfortune to revoke. Quite so, said Tommy. I should just like to know one thing. What is Mrs. Betts' attitude in all this? Well, she wanted me to call in the police, said Colonel Kingston Bruce reluctantly. That is, when we'd searched everywhere in case the pearl had only dropped off. But you dissuaded her? I was very adverse to the idea of publicity, but my wife and daughter backed me up. Then my wife remembered that young St. Vincent spoke about you at dinner last night in that 24-hour special service. Yes, said Tommy, with heavy heart. You see, in any case, no harm will be done. I mean, if we call in the police tomorrow, it could be supposed that we just thought the jewel merely lost and we were hunting for it. By the way, nobody's been allowed to leave the house this morning. Except your daughter, of course, said Tuppence, speaking for the first time. Except my daughter, agreed the Colonel. She volunteered at once to go and put the case before you. Tommy rose. We will do our best to give you satisfaction, Colonel, he said, but I should like to see the drawing-room and the table on which the pendant was laid down. I should also like to ask Mrs. Betts a few questions. After that, I will interview the servants, or rather my assistant, Miss Robinson, will do so. He felt his nerve quailing before the terrors of questioning the servants. Colonel Kingston Bruce threw open the door and led them across the hall. As he did so, a remark came to them clearly through the open door of the room they were approaching, and the voice that uttered it was that of the girl who had come to see them that morning. "You know perfectly well, Mother," she was saying, "that she did bring home a teaspoon in her muff." In another minute, they were being introduced to Mrs. Kingston Bruce, a plaintive lady with a languid manner. Miss Kingston Bruce acknowledged their presence with a short inclination of the head. Her face was more sullen than ever. Mrs. Kingston Bruce was voluble. "Oh, but I know who I think took it," she ended. "That dreadful socialist young man. He loves the Russians and the Germans and hates the English. What else can you expect?" "He never touched it," said Miss Kingston Bruce fiercely. "I was watching him all the time. I couldn't have failed to see if he had." She looked at them defiantly, with her chin up. Tommy created a diversion by asking for an interview with Mrs. Betts. When Mrs. Kingston Bruce had departed, accompanied by her husband and daughter to find Mrs. Betts, he whistled thoughtfully. "I wonder," he said gently, "who it was who had a teaspoon in her muff." "Just what I was thinking," replied Tuppence. Mrs. Betts, followed by her husband, burst into the room. She was a big woman with a determined voice. Mr. Hamilton Betts looked colourless and subdued. "I understand, Miss Blunt, that you are a private inquiry agent, and one who hustles things through at great rate." "Hustle," said Tommy, "is my middle name, Mrs. Betts. Let me ask you a few questions." Thereafter things proceeded rapidly. Tommy was shown the damaged pendant, the table on which it had lain, and Mr. Betts emerged from his taciturnity to mention the value in dollars of the stolen pearl. And withal, Tommy felt an irritating certainty that he was not getting on. "I think that will do," he said, at length. "Miss Robinson, will you kindly fetch the special photographic apparatus from the hall?" Miss Robinson complied. "Oh, a little invention of my own," said Tommy. "In appearance, you see, it's just like an ordinary camera." He had some slight satisfaction in seeing that the Betts were impressed. He photographed the pendant, the table on which it had lain, and took several general views of the room. Then Miss Robinson was delegated to interview the servants, and in view of the eager expectancy on the faces of Colonel Kingston Bruce and Mrs. Betts, Tommy felt called upon to say a few authoritative words. "The position amounts to this," he said. "Either the pearl is still in the house, or it is not still in the house." "Quite so," said the Colonel, with more respect than was, perhaps, quite justified by the nature of the remark. "If it is not in the house, it may be anywhere. But if it is in the house, it must necessarily be concealed somewhere." "And a search must be made," broke in Colonel Kingston Bruce. "Quite so. I give you carte blanche, Mr. Blunt. Search the house from attic to cellar." "Oh, Charles," murmured Mrs. Kingston Bruce tearfully, "do you think that is wise? The servants won't like it. Oh, I'm sure they'll leave." "We will search their quarters last," said Tommy, soothingly. "The thief is sure to have hidden the gem in the most unlikely place."
"I seem to have read something of the kind,"
agreed the Colonel. "Quite so," said Tommy. "You probably remember the case of Rex v. Bailey, which created a precedent."
Oh, yes,"
said the Colonel, looking puzzled. "Now, the most unlikely place is in the apartment of Mrs. Betts," continued Tommy.
"My, wouldn't that be cute?"
said Mrs. Betts admiringly. Without more ado, she took him up to her room, where Tommy once more made use of the special photographic apparatus. Presently, Tuppence joined him there. "You have no objection, I hope, Mrs. Betts, to my assistant looking through your wardrobe?"
"Why, not at all. Do you need me here any longer?"
Tommy assured her there was no need to detain her, and Mrs. Betts departed. "Oh, we might as well go on bluffing it out," said Tommy. "But personally, I don't believe we've got a dog's chance of finding the thing. Curse you and your 24-hour service, Tuppence." "Listen," said Tuppence. "The servants are all right, I'm sure. but I managed to get something out of the French maid. It seems that when Lady Laura was staying here a year ago, she went out to tea with some friends of the Kingston Bruces, and when she got home, a teaspoon fell out of her muff. Everyone thought it must have got in there by accident. But talking about similar robberies, I got hold of a lot more. Lady Laura is always staying about with people. Now, she hasn't got a bean, I gather, and she's out for comfortable quarters with people to whom a title still means something. It may be coincidence, or it may be something more, but 5 distinct thefts have taken place while she's been staying in various houses, sometimes trivial things, sometimes valuable jewels. "Whew," said Tommy, and gave vent to a prolonged whistle. "Where's the old bird's room, do you know?" "Just across the passage." "Then I rather think, we'll just slip across and investigate." The room opposite stood with its door ajar. It was a spacious room, with white enamelled fitments and rose-pink curtains. An inner door led to a bathroom. At the door of this appeared a slim, dark girl, very neatly dressed. Tuppence checked the exclamation of astonishment on the girl's lips. "This is Elise, Mr. Blunt," she said primly, "Lady Laura's maid." Tommy stepped across the threshold of the bathroom and approved inwardly its sumptuous and up-to-date fittings. He set to work to dispel the wide stare of suspicion on the French girl's face. "You are busy with your duties, eh, Mademoiselle Elise?" "Yes, monsieur. I clean milady's bath." "Well, perhaps you'll help me with some photography instead. I have a special kind of camera here, and I'm photographing the interiors of all the rooms in this house." He was interrupted by the communicating door to the bedroom banging suddenly behind him. Elise jumped at the sound. "What did that?" "It must have been the wind," said Tuppence. "We will come into the other room," said Tommy. Elise went to open the door for them, but the doorknob rattled aimlessly. "What's the matter?" said Tommy sharply. "Ah, monsieur, but somebody must have locked it on the other side." She caught up a towel and tried again. But this time the door handle turned easily enough, and the door swung open. "Voilà ce qui est curieux. It must have been stuck," said Elise. There was no one in the bedroom. Tommy fetched his apparatus. Tommy and Elise worked under his orders, but again and again his glance went back to the communicating door. "I wonder," he said between his teeth, "I wonder why that door stuck." He examined it minutely, shutting and opening it. It fitted perfectly. "One picture more," he said with a sigh. "Will you loop back that rose curtain, Mademoiselle Elise? Thank you. Just hold it so." The familiar click occurred. He handed a glass slide to Elise to hold, relinquished the tripod to Tuppence, and carefully readjusted and closed the camera. He made some easy excuse to get rid of Elise, and as soon as she was out of the room, he caught hold of Tuppence and spoke rapidly. "Look here, I've got an idea. Can you hang on here? Search all the rooms, that'll take some time. Try and get an interview with the old bird, Lady Laura, but don't alarm her. Tell her you suspect the parlour-maid. But whatever you do, don't let her leave the house. I'm going off in the car. I'll be back as soon as I can." "All right," said Tuppence, "but don't be too cocksure. You've forgotten one thing. The girl. There's something funny about that girl. Now listen, I found out the time she started from the house this morning. It took her 2 hours to get to our office. Well, that's nonsense. Where did she go before she came to us?" "There's something in that," admitted her husband. "Well, follow up any old clue you like, but don't let Lady Laura leave the house." "Huh, what's that?" His quick ear had caught a faint rustle outside on the landing. He strode across to the door, but there was no one to be seen. "Well, so long," he said. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Tuppence watched him drive off in the car with a faint misgiving. Tommy was very sure. She herself was not so sure. There were one or two things she did not quite understand. She was still standing by the window, watching the road, when she saw a man leave the shelter of a gateway opposite, cross the road, and ring the bell. In a flash, Tuppence was out of the room and down the stairs. Gladys Hill, the parlour-maid, was emerging from the back part of the house, but Tuppence motioned her back authoritatively. Then she went to the front door and opened it. A lanky young man with ill-fitting clothes and eager, dark eyes was standing on the step. He hesitated a moment and then said, Is Miss Kingston Bruce in?" "Will you come inside?" said Tuppence. She stood aside to let him enter, closing the door. "Mr. Rennie, I think," she said sweetly. He shot a quick glance at her. Yes." "Will you come in here, please?" She opened the study door. The room was empty, and Tuppence entered it after him, closing the door behind her. He turned on her with a frown. "I want to see Miss Kingston Bruce." "I'm not quite sure that you can," said Tuppence, composedly.
"Look here, who the devil are you?" said Mr. Rennie rudely.
"International Detective Agency," said Tuppence succinctly, and noticed Mr. Rennie's uncontrollable start. "Please sit down, Mr. Rennie," she went on. "To begin with, we know all about Miss Kingston Bruce's visit to you this morning." It was a bold guess, but it succeeded. Perceiving his consternation, Tuppence went on quickly. "The recovery of the pearl is the great thing, Mr. Rennie. No one in this house is anxious for publicity. Can't we come to some arrangement?" The young man looked at her keenly. "I wonder how much you know," he said thoughtfully. Let me think for a moment." He buried his head in his hands, then asked a most unexpected question. "I say, is it really true that young St. Vincent is engaged to be married?" "Quite true," said Tuppence. "I know the girl." Mr. Rennie suddenly became confidential. "It's been hell," he confided. "They've been asking him morning, noon, and night, chucking Beatrice at his head. All because he'll come into a title some day. If I had my way—" "Don't let's talk politics," said Tuppence hastily. "Do you mind telling me, Mr. Rennie, why you think Miss Kingston Bruce took the pearl?" I don't." "You do," said Tuppence calmly. "You wait to see the detective, as you think, drive off and the coast clear, and then you come and ask for her. It's obvious. If you'd taken the pearl yourself, you wouldn't be half so upset." "Her manner was so odd," said the young man. "She came this morning and told me about the robbery, explaining that she was on her way to a firm of private detectives. She seemed anxious to say something, and not able to get it out." "Well," said Tuppence, "all I want is the pearl. You'd better go and talk to her." But at that moment, Colonel Kingston Bruce opened the door.
Lunch is ready, Miss Robinson. You will lunch with us, I hope.
Then he stopped and glared at the guest. "Clearly," said Mr. Rennie, "you don't want to ask me to lunch. All right, I'll go." "Come back later," whispered Tuppence, as he passed her. Tuppence followed Colonel Kingston Bruce, still growling into his moustache about the pestilential impudence of some people, into a massive dining room where the family was already assembled. Only one person present was unknown to Tuppence.
"This, Lady Laura, is Miss Robinson, who is kindly assisting us."
Lady Laura bent her head, and then proceeded to stare at Tuppence through her pince-nez. She was a tall, thin woman, with a sad smile, a gentle voice, and very hard, shrewd eyes. Tuppence returned her stare, and Lady Laura's eyes dropped. After lunch, Lady Laura entered into conversation with an air of gentle curiosity. "How was the inquiry proceeding?" Tuppence laid suitable stress on the suspicion attaching to the parlour-maid, but her mind was not really on Lady Laura. Lady Laura might conceal teaspoons and other articles in her clothing, but Tuppence felt fairly sure that she had not taken the pink pearl. Presently Tuppence proceeded with her search of the house. Time was going on. There was no sign of Tommy, and what mattered far more to Tuppence, there was no sign of Mr. Rennie. Suddenly, Tuppence came out of a bedroom and collided with Beatrice Kingston Bruce, who was going downstairs. She was fully dressed for the street. "I'm afraid," said Tuppence, "that you mustn't go out just now." The other girl looked at her haughtily. "Whether I go out is no business of yours," she said coldly. "It is my business whether I communicate with the police or not, though," said Tuppence. In a minute the girl had turned ashen pale. "You mustn't. You mustn't. I won't go out, but please don't do that." She clung to Tuppence beseechingly. "My dear Miss Kingston Bruce," said Tuppence, smiling, "the case has been perfectly clear to me from the start. But she was interrupted. In the stress of her encounter with the girl, Tuppence had not heard the front door-bell. Now, to her astonishment, Tommy came bounding up the stairs, and in the hall below she caught sight of a big, burly man in the act of removing a bowler hat. "Detective Inspector Marriott of Scotland Yard," he said with a grin. With a cry, Beatrice Kingston Bruce tore herself from Tuppence's grasp and dashed down the stairs, just as the front door was opened once more to admit Mr. Rennie. "Now you have torn it," said Tuppence bitterly. "Huh?" said Tommy, hurrying into Lady Laura's room. He passed on into the bathroom and picked up a large cake of soap, which he had brought out in his hands. The inspector was just mounting the stairs. "She went quite quietly," he announced. "She's an old hand and knows when the game is up. What about the pearl?" "I rather fancy," said Tommy, handing him the soap, "that you'll find it in here." The inspector's eyes lit up appreciatively. "An old trick and a good one. Cut a cake of soap in half, scoop out a place for the jewel, clap it together again, and smooth the join well over with hot water. A very smart piece of work on your part, sir." Tommy accepted the compliment gracefully. He and Tuppence descended the stairs. Colonel Kingston Bruce rushed at him and shook him warmly by the hand.
"Ah, my dear sir, I can't thank you enough. Lady Laura wants to thank you also."
"I'm glad we've given you satisfaction," said Tommy, "but I'm afraid I can't stop. Most urgent appointment. Member of the Cabinet." He hurried out to the car and jumped in. Tuppence jumped in beside him. "But, Tommy," she cried, "haven't they arrested Lady Laura after all?" "Oh," said Tommy, "didn't I tell you? They've not arrested Lady Laura. They've arrested Elise. You see," he went on, as Tuppence sat dumbfounded, "I've often tried to open a door with soap on my hands myself. It can't be done. Your hands slip. So I wondered what Elise could have been doing with a soap to get her hands as soapy as all that. She caught up a towel, remember, so there were no traces of soap on the handle afterwards. But it occurred to me that if you were a professional thief, it wouldn't be a bad plan to be a maid to a lady suspected of kleptomania, who stayed about a good deal in different houses. So I managed to get a photo of her as well as of the room, induced her to handle a glass slide, and toddled off to dear old Scotland Yard. Lightning development of negative, successful identification of fingerprints, and photo. Elise was a long-lost friend. Useful place, Scotland Yard." "And to think," said Tuppence, finding her voice, "that those two young idiots were only suspecting each other in that weak way they do in books. But why didn't you tell me what you were up to when you were off?" In the first place, I suspected that Elise was listening on the landing, and in the second place—" "Yes?" "My learned friend forgets," said Tommy. "Thorndyke never tells until the last moment. Besides, Tuppence, you and your pal, Janet Smith, put one over on me last time. This makes us all square." Finessing the King. It was a wet Wednesday in the offices of the International Detective Agency. Tuppence let the Daily Leader fall idly from her hand. "Do you know what I've been thinking, Tommy?" "It's impossible to say," replied her husband. "You think of so many things, and you think of them all at once." "I think it's time we went dancing again." Tommy picked up the Daily Leader hastily. "Our advertisement looks well," he remarked, his head on one side. "Blunt's Brilliant Detectives." Do you realize, Tuppence, that you and you alone are Blunt's brilliant detectives? There's glory for you, as Humpty Dumpty would say. I was talking about dancing. There's a curious point that I have observed about newspapers. I wonder if you've ever noticed it. Take these 3 copies of the Daily Leader. Can you tell me how they differ one from the other? Tuppence took them with some curiosity. It seems fairly easy, she remarked witheringly. One is today's, one is yesterday's, and one is the day before's. Positively scintillating, my dear Watson, but that was not my meaning. Observe the headline, Daily Leader. Compare the 3. Do you see any difference between them? No, I don't, said Tuppence. And what's more, I don't believe there is any. Tommy sighed, and brought the tips of his fingers together in the most approved Sherlock Holmes fashion. Exactly. Yet you read the papers as much, in fact, more than I do. But I have observed, and you have not. If you look at today's Daily Leader, you will see that in the middle of the downstroke of this D is a small white dot, and there's another in the L of the same word. But in yesterday's paper, the white dot is not in Daily at all. There are 2 white dots in the L of Leader. That of the day before has 2 dots in the D of Daily. In fact, the dot, or dots, are in a different position every day. Why? Asked Tuppence. That's a journalistic secret. Meaning you don't know and can't guess. I will merely say this. The practice is common to all newspapers. Aren't you clever? Said Tuppence. Especially at drawing red herrings across the track. Let's go back to what we were talking about before. What were we talking about? The 3 Arts Ball. Tommy groaned. No, no, Tuppence. Not the 3 Arts Ball. I'm not young enough. I assure you I'm not young enough. When I was a nice young girl, said Tuppence, I was brought up to believe that men, especially husbands, were dissipated beings, fond of drinking and dancing and staying up late at night. It took an exceptionally beautiful and clever wife to keep them at home. Another illusion gone. All the wives I know are hankering to go out and dance, and weeping because their husbands will wear bedroom slippers and go to bed at 9:30. And you do dance so nicely, Tommy dear. Gently with the butter, Tuppence. As a matter of fact, said Tuppence, it's not purely for pleasure that I want to go. I'm intrigued by this advertisement. She picked up the Daily Leader again and read it out. I should go 3 hearts, 12 tricks, ace of spades, necessary to finesse the king. Rather an expensive way of learning bridge, was Tommy's comment. Don't be an ass. That's nothing to do with bridge. You see, I was lunching with a girl yesterday at the Ace of Spades. It's a queer little underground den in Chelsea, and she told me that it's quite the fashion of these big shows to trundle round there in the course of the evening for bacon and eggs and Welsh rarebits, bohemian sort of stuff. It's got screened-off booths all around it. Pretty hot place, I should say. And your idea is 3 hearts stands for the 3 Arts Ball. Tomorrow night. 12 tricks is 12 o'clock, and the Ace of Spades is the Ace of Spades. And what about its being necessary to finesse the king? Well, that's what I thought we'd find out. I shouldn't wonder if you weren't right, Tuppence, said Tommy magnanimously. But I don't quite see why you want to butt in upon other people's love affairs. I shan't butt in. What I'm proposing is an interesting experiment in detective work. We need practice. Business is certainly not too brisk, agreed Tommy. All the same, Tuppence, what you want is to go to the 3 Arts Ball and dance. Talk of red herrings. Tuppence laughed shamelessly. Oh, be a sport, Tommy. Try and forget you're 32 and have got one grey hair in your left eyebrow. I was always weak where women were concerned, murmured her husband. Have I got to make an ass of myself in fancy dress? Of course, but you can leave that to me. I've got a splendid idea. Tommy looked at her with some misgiving. He was always profoundly mistrustful of Tuppence's brilliant ideas. When he returned to the flat on the following evening, Tuppence came flying out of her bedroom to meet him. "It's come," she announced. "What's come?" "The costume. Come and look at it." Tommy followed her. Spread out on the bed was a complete fireman's kit with shining helmet. "Oh, good God," groaned Tommy. "Have I joined the Wembley Fire Brigade?" "Guess again," said Tuppence. "You haven't caught the idea yet. Use your little grey cells, mon ami. Scintillate, Watson." Wait a minute," said Tommy. "I begin to see. There's a dark purpose in all this. What are you going to wear, Tuppence?" "An old suit of your clothes, an American hat, and some horn spectacles." "Crude," said Tommy, "but I catch the idea. McCarty incognito, and I am Reardon." "That's it. I thought we ought to practice American detective methods as well as the English ones. Just for once, I am going to be the star, and you will be the humble assistant." "Don't forget," said Tommy warningly, "that is always an innocent remark by the simple Denny that puts McCarty on the right track." But Tuppence only laughed. She was in high spirits. It was a most successful evening. The crowds, the music, the fantastic dresses, everything conspired to make the young couple enjoy themselves. Tommy forgot his role of the bored husband dragged out against his will. At 10 minutes to 12, they drove off in the car to the famous, or infamous, Ace of Spades. As Tuppence had said, it was an underground den, mean and tawdry in appearance, but it was nevertheless crowded with couples in fancy dress. There were closed-in booths around the walls, and Tommy and Tuppence secured one of these. They left the doors purposely a little ajar, so they could see what was going on outside. "I wonder which they are. Our people, I mean," said Tuppence. "What about that Columbine over there, with the red Mephistopheles?" "I fancy the wicked Mandarin and the lady who calls herself a battleship. More of a fast cruiser, I should say." "Isn't he witty?" said Tuppence. "All done on a little drop of drink. Who's this coming in dressed as the Queen of Hearts? Rather a good get-up, that." The girl in question passed into the booth next to them, accompanied by her escort, who was the gentleman dressed in newspaper from Alice in Wonderland. They were both wearing masks. It seemed to be rather a common custom at the Ace of Spades. "I'm sure we're in a real den of iniquity," said Tuppence with a pleased face. "Scandals all around us. Oh, what a row everyone makes." A cry, as of protest, rang out from the booth next door and was covered by a man's loud laugh. Everybody was laughing and singing. The shrill voices of the girls rose above the booming of their male escorts. "What about that shepherdess?" demanded Tommy. "The one with the comic Frenchman. They might be our little lot." "Anyone might be," confessed Tuppence. "I'm not going to bother. The great thing is that we're enjoying ourselves." "I could have enjoyed myself better in another costume," grumbled Tommy. "You've no idea of the heat of this one." "Cheer up," said Tuppence. "You look lovely." "Well, I'm glad of that," said Tommy. "It's more than you do. You're the funniest little guy I've ever seen." "Will you keep a civil tongue in your head, Denny, my boy?" "Hello! The gentleman in newspaper is leaving his lady alone. Where's he going, do you think?" "Going to hurry up the drinks, I expect," said Tommy. "I wouldn't mind doing the same thing." "He's a long time doing it," said Tuppence, when 4 or 5 minutes had passed. "Tommy, would you think me an awful ass if—" She paused. Suddenly she jumped up. "Call me an ass if you like. I'm going in next door." "Now look here, Tuppence, you can't—" "I've a feeling there's something wrong. I know there is. Don't try and stop me." She passed quickly out of their own booth, and Tommy followed her. The doors of the one next door were closed. Tuppence pushed them apart and went in, Tommy on her heels. The girl, dressed as the Queen of Hearts, sat in the corner, leaning up against the wall in a queer, huddled position. Her eyes regarded them steadily through her mask, but she did not move. Her dress was carried out in a bold design of red and white, but on the left-hand side the pattern seemed to have got mixed. There was more red than there should have been. With a cry, Tuppence hurried forward. At the same time, Tommy saw what she had seen, the hilt of a jewelled dagger just below the heart. Tuppence dropped on her knees by the girl's side. "Quick, Tommy, she's still alive. Get hold of the manager and make him get a doctor at once." "Right. Mind you don't touch the handle of that dagger, Tuppence." "I'll be careful. Go, quickly." Tommy hurried out, pulling the doors to behind him. Tuppence passed her arm round the girl. The latter made a faint gesture, and Tuppence realized that she wanted to get rid of the mask. Tuppence unfastened it gently. She saw a fresh, flower-like face, and wide, starry eyes that were full of horror, suffering, and a kind of dazed bewilderment. "My dear," said Tuppence very gently, "can you speak at all? Will you tell me, if you can, who did this?" She felt the eyes fix themselves on her face. The girl was sighing, the deep, palpitating sighs of a failing heart. And still she looked steadily at Tuppence. Then her lips parted. "Bingo did it," she said in a strained whisper. Then her hands relaxed, and she seemed to nestle down on Tuppence's shoulder. Tommy came in, 2 men with him. The bigger of the 2 came forward with an air of authority, the word doctor written all over him. Tuppence relinquished her burden. "She's dead, I'm afraid," she said, with a catch in her voice. The doctor made a swift examination. "Yes," he said. "Nothing to be done. You'd better leave things as they are till the police come. How did the thing happen?" Tuppence explained rather haltingly, slurring over her reasons for entering the booth. "Curious business," said the doctor. "You heard nothing." "I heard her give a kind of cry, but then the man laughed. Naturally, I didn't think—" "Oh, naturally not," agreed the doctor. "And the man wore a mask, you say. You wouldn't recognize him?" "I'm afraid not. Would you, Tommy?" "No. Still, there is his costume." "The first thing will be to identify this poor lady," said the doctor. "After that, well, I suppose the police will get down to things pretty quickly. It ought not to be a difficult case. Ah, here they come." It was after 3 o'clock when, weary and sick at heart, the husband and wife reached home. Several hours passed before Tuppence could sleep. She lay tossing from side to side, seeing always that flower-like face with the horror-stricken eyes. The dawn was coming in through the shutters when Tuppence finally dropped off to sleep. After the excitement, she slept heavily and dreamlessly. It was broad daylight when she awoke to find Tommy, up and dressed, standing by the bedside, shaking her gently by the arm. "Wake up, old thing. Inspector Marriott and another man are here, and they want to see you." "What time is it?" "Just on 11. I'll get Alice to bring you your tea right away." "Oh, yes, yes, do. Tell Inspector Marriott I'll be there in 10 minutes. A quarter of an hour later, Tuppence came hurrying into the sitting-room. Inspector Marriott, who was sitting looking very straight and solemn, rose to greet her. "Morning, Mrs. Beresford. This is Sir Arthur Merivale." Tuppence shook hands with a tall, thin man with haggard eyes and greying hair. "It's about this sad business last night," said Inspector Marriott. "I want Sir Arthur to hear from your own lips what you told me, the words the poor lady said before she died."
Sir Arthur has been very hard to convince." "I can't believe," said the other, "and I won't believe, that Bingo Hale ever hurt a hair of Vere's head." Inspector Marriott went on. "We've made some progress since last night, Mrs. Beresford," he said. "First of all, we managed to identify the lady as Lady Merivale. We communicated with Sir Arthur here. Oh, he recognised the body at once and was horrified beyond words, of course. Then I asked him if he knew anyone called Bingo." "You must understand, Mrs. Beresford," said Sir Arthur, "that Captain Hale, who is known to all his friends as Bingo, is the dearest pal I have. He practically lives with us. He was staying at my house when they arrested him this morning. I can't but believe that you've made a mistake. It was not his name that my wife uttered." "There is no possibility of mistake," said Tuppence gently. "She said Bingo did it." "You see, Sir Arthur," said Marriott. The unhappy man sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. "It's incredible. What earthly motive could there be? Oh, I know your idea, Inspector Marriott. You think Hale was my wife's lover. But even if that was so, which I don't admit for a moment, what motive was there for killing her?" Inspector Marriott coughed. "Not a very pleasant thing to say, sir, but Captain Hale has been paying a lot of attention to a certain young American lady of late. A young lady with a considerable amount of money. If Lady Merivale liked to turn nasty, she could probably stop his marriage." "Oh, this is outrageous, Inspector!" Sir Arthur sprang angrily to his feet. The other calmed him with a soothing gesture. "I beg your pardon, I'm sure, Sir Arthur. You say that you and Captain Hale both decided to attend this show. Your wife was away on a visit at the time, and you had no idea that she was to be there?" "Not the least idea." "Just show him that advertisement you told me about, Mrs. Beresford." Tuppence complied. "That seems to me clear enough. It was inserted by Captain Hale to catch your wife's eye. They'd already arranged to meet there, but you only made up your mind to go the day before, hence it was necessary to warn her. That's the explanation of the phrase, 'necessary to finesse the king.' You ordered your costume from a theatrical firm at the last minute, but Captain Hale's was a homemade affair. He went as the gentleman dressed in newspaper. You know, Sir Arthur, what we found clasped in the dead lady's hand? A fragment torn from a newspaper. My men have orders to take Captain Hale's costume away with him from your house. I shall find it at the yard when I get back. If there's a tear in it corresponding to the missing piece, well, that'll be the end of the case." "But you won't find it," said Sir Arthur. "I know Bingo Hale." Apologising to Tuppence for disturbing her, they took their leave. Late that evening there was a ring at the bell, and somewhat to the astonishment of the young pair, Inspector Marriott once more walked in. "I thought Blunt's brilliant detectives would like to hear the latest developments," he said, with a hint of a smile. "They would," said Tommy. "Have a drink." He placed materials hospitably at Inspector Marriott's elbow. "It's a clear case," said the latter, after a minute or two. "Dagger was the lady's own. The idea was to have made it look like suicide, evidently, but thanks to you two being on the spot, that didn't come off. We found plenty of letters they'd been carrying on together for some time. Yes, that's clear, without Sir Arthur tumbling to it. And then we found the last link." "The last what?" said Tuppence, sharply. "The last link in the chain. That fragment of the Daily Leader. It was torn from the costume he wore. It fits exactly. Oh, yeah. It's a perfectly clear case. By the way, I brought you round a photograph of those two exhibits. I thought they might interest you. Very seldom that you get such a perfectly clear case." "Tommy," said Tuppence, when her husband returned from showing the Scotland Yard man out, "why do you think Inspector Marriott keeps repeating that it's a A perfectly clear case. I don't know. Smug satisfaction, I suppose. Not a bit of it. He's trying to get us irritated. You know, Tommy, butchers, for instance, know something about meat, don't they? Well, I should say so, but what on earth? And in the same way, greengrocers know all about vegetables and fishermen about fish. Detectives, professional detectives, must know all about criminals. They know the real thing when they see it, and they know when it isn't the real thing. Marriott's expert knowledge tells him that Captain Hale isn't a criminal, but all the facts are dead against him. As a last resource, Marriott is egging us on, hoping against hope that some little detail or other will come back to us, something that happened last night, which will throw a different light on things. Tommy, why shouldn't it be suicide after all? Well, remember what she said to you. I know, but take that a different way. It was Bingo's doing. His conduct that drove her to kill herself. It is just possible. Just. But it doesn't explain that fragment of newspaper. Let's have a look at Marriott's photographs. I forgot to ask him what Hale's account of the matter was. I asked him that in the hall just now. Hale declared he'd never spoken to Lady Merivale at the show. Says somebody shoved a note into his hand which said, "Don't try and speak to me tonight. Arthur suspects." He couldn't produce the piece of paper, though. It doesn't sound a very likely story. Anyway, you and I know he was with her at the Ace of Spades because we saw him. Tuppence nodded and pored over the two photographs. One was a tiny fragment with the legend Daily Le, and the rest torn off. The other was the front sheet of the Daily Leader with a small round tear at the top of it. There was no doubt about it. Those two fitted together perfectly. "What are all those marks down the side?" asked Tommy. "Stitches," said Tuppence. "When it was sewn to the others. Oh, you know." "I thought it might be a new scheme of dots," said Tommy. Then he gave a slight shiver. "My word, Tuppence, how creepy it makes one feel. To think that you and I were discussing dots and puzzling over that advertisement, all as light-hearted as anything." Tuppence did not answer. Tommy looked at her and was startled to observe that she was staring ahead of her, her mouth slightly open, and a bewildered expression on her face. "Tuppence," said Tommy gently, shaking her by the arm, "what is the matter with you? Are you just going to have a stroke or something?" But Tuppence remained motionless. Presently she said in a far-away voice, "Dennis Reardon." "What?" said Tommy, staring. "It's just as you said. One simple, innocent remark. Find me all this week's Daily Leaders. What are you up to?" "I'm being McCarty. I've been worrying round, and thanks to you, I've got a notion at last. This is the front sheet of Tuesday's paper. I seem to remember that Tuesday's paper was the one with 2 dots in the L of Leader. This has a dot in the D of Daily, and 1 in the L, too. Get me the papers and let's make sure." They compared them anxiously. Tuppence had been quite right in her remembrance. "You see, this fragment wasn't torn from Tuesday's paper." "Oh, but Tuppence, we can't be sure. It may be merely different editions." "It may, but at any rate it's given me an idea. It can't be coincidence, that's certain. There's only one thing it can be if I'm right in my idea. Ring up Sir Arthur, Tommy. Ask him to come round here at once. Say I've got important news for him. Then get hold of Marriott. Scotland Yard will know his address if he's gone home." Sir Arthur Merivale, very much intrigued by the summons, arrived at the flat in about half an hour's time. Tuppence came forward to greet him. "I must apologize for sending for you in such a peremptory fashion," she said. "But my husband and I have discovered something that we think you ought to know at once. Do sit down." Sir Arthur sat down, and Tuppence went on. "You are, I know, very anxious to clear your friend." Sir Arthur shook his head sadly. "I was, but even I have had to give in to the overwhelming evidence." "What would you say if I told you that chance has placed in my hands a piece of evidence that will certainly clear him of all complicity?" "Well, I should be overjoyed to hear it, Mrs. Beresford." "Supposing," continued Tuppence, "that I had come across a girl who was actually dancing with Captain Hale last night at 12 o'clock, the hour when he was supposed to be at the Ace of Spades." "Well, it's marvellous!" cried Sir Arthur. "I knew there was some mistake. Poor Vere must have killed herself after all." "Hardly that," said Tuppence. "You forget the other man." "Well, what other man?" "The one my husband and I saw leave the booth. You see, Sir Arthur, there must have been a second man dressed in newspaper at the ball. Oh, by the way, what was your own costume?" "Mine? I went as a 17th century executioner." "How very appropriate," said Tuppence softly. "Appropriate, Mrs. Beresford? What do you mean by appropriate?" "For the part you played. Shall I tell you my ideas on the subject, Sir Arthur? The newspaper dress is easily put on over that of an executioner. Previously, a little note has been slipped into Captain Hale's hand, asking him not to speak to a certain lady. But the lady herself knows nothing of that note. She goes to the Ace of Spades at the appointed time and sees the figure she expects to see. They go into the booth. He takes her in his arms, I think, and kisses her, the kiss of a Judas. And as he kisses, he strikes with the dagger. She only utters one faint cry, and he covers that with a laugh. Presently he goes away, and to the last, horrified and bewildered, she believes her lover is the man who killed her. But she has torn a small fragment from the costume. The murderer notices that. He is a man who pays great attention to detail. To make the case absolutely clear against his victim, the fragment must seem to have been torn from Captain Hale's costume. That would present great difficulties, unless the two men happen to be living in the same house. Then, of course, the thing would be simplicity itself. He makes an exact duplicate of the tear in Captain Hale's costume. Then he burns his own and prepares to play the part of the loyal friend." Tuppence paused. "Well, Sir Arthur?" Sir Arthur rose and made her a bow. "The rather vivid imagination of a charming lady who reads too much fiction." "You think so?" said Tommy. "And a husband who is guided by his wife," said Sir Arthur. "I do not fancy you will find anybody to take the matter seriously." He laughed out loud, and Tuppence stiffened in her chair. "I would swear to that laugh anywhere," she said. "I heard it last in the Ace of Spades. And you are under a little misapprehension about us both. Beresford is our real name, but we have another." She picked up a card from the table and handed it to him. Sir Arthur read it aloud. "International Detective Agency." He drew his breath sharply. "So that is what you really are. That was why Marriott brought me here this morning. It was a trap." He strolled over to the window. "Oh, a fine view you have from here," he said. "Right over London." "Inspector Marriott!" cried Tommy sharply. In a flash the inspector appeared from the communicating door in the opposite wall. A little smile of amusement came to Sir Arthur's lips. "I thought as much," he said. "But you won't get me this time, I'm afraid, Inspector. I prefer to take my own way out." And putting his hands on the sill, he vaulted clean through the window. Tuppence shrieked and clapped her hands to her ears to shut out the sound she had already imagined, the sickening thud far beneath. Inspector Marriott uttered an oath. "Should have thought of that window," he said. "Though, mind you, it's been a difficult thing to prove. I'll go down and, see to things." "Poor devil," said Tommy slowly. "If he really was fond of his wife—" But the inspector interrupted him with a snort. "Fond of her? Oh, well, that's as maybe. He was at his wits' end where to turn for money. Lady Merivale had a large fortune of her own, and it all went to him. If she'd bolted with young Hale, he'd have never seen a penny of it." "Oh, that was it, was it?" "Well, of course, from the start, I sensed that Sir Arthur was a bad lot, and that Captain Hale was, well, all right. We know pretty well what's what at the Yard, but it's awkward when you're up against facts. Well, I'll be going down now. I should give your wife a glass of brandy if I were you, Mr. Beresford. It's been upsetting like for her."
"Greengrocers," said Tuppence in a low voice, as the door closed behind the imperturbable inspector. "Butchers, fishermen, detectives. I was right, wasn't I? He knew." Tommy, who had been busy at the sideboard, approached her with a large glass. "Drink this." "What is it? Brandy?" "No, it's a large cocktail, suitable for a triumphant Maccarty. Yes, Marriott's right all round. That was the way of it. A bold finesse for game and rubber." Tuppence nodded. "But he finessed the wrong way round." "And so," said Tommy, "exit the king."